All right, so a little intro. Welcome, everybody. This is our third session on cross-organizational collaboration. We have a good mix of folks today, and we hope to have a good conversation. It's always pretty organic, and I think it works well that way. Welcome, Alan and Kevin. We're going to start with introductions quickly with the new folks, and I'll start with you, Veronica, if you don't mind just giving a quick introduction.
Yes, of course. Veronica Högberg is my name. I work as a senior researcher with Siemens, the Siemens research team, around topics of semantic technologies, digital twins, ontologies, all that kind of necessities actually to integrate data. My background is from linguistics originally, but I've been working with data modeling ever like the last 20 years.
Okay.
So that's myself.
Thanks for joining. Emmanuel.
Yes, hello. My name is Emmanuel Salinger. I'm from TU Wien, Austria, professor there, and also lecturer at Oxford University on knowledge graphs and a lot of these topics associated around that. And I'm quite excited about these discussions of using, somehow aspects where we have the technological side, knowledge graphs, data mesh, and so on. But just as a quick 1-2 sentence summary of an interesting conference I was on 2 weeks ago, organized by one of the senior knowledge graph people, Chaitan Barrow and others, was about social aspects of knowledge graphs, including collaboration. And basically, there were social scientists there, technical people are also there. And one of the big discussions was, okay, have we solved all of the technical things? Probably not, but we have still even more non-solved things on the social side and collaboration and so on. And we need to use more of our energy to work on these topics. And that's why I think this round here is a great place to be. So I will stop the 2-sentence introduction, and maybe we later speak a bit about that.
Absolutely. Welcome aboard. Eric.
Sure. My name is Eric Rhoda. I'm out of Toronto, Canada. I have been in the industry, financial services, for about 30 plus years. Executive at a bank, insurance companies. In the last 6 or 7 years, I've spun up my own consulting company, and I do a few things. One is, most recently, the last 2 years, I've been doing strategies as well as implementing global data mesh capabilities across various financial services firms, and building API platforms, event streaming platforms for a number of companies. Right now, building a marketplace / ecosystem for a major payments, global payments company that is trying to bring together subscribers who want to execute payments with providers who want to provide payment services, and bringing them into a marketplace, a data mesh in effect to really build that ecosystem and supercharge the interactions. I've written a ton of articles on data mesh, and you can take if you just do a quick search on me, you'll find them out there.
And good ones too, I might add. I've added into the newsletter a number of times. Next, Olivier, and welcome. Thanks for joining. Another veteran of the data mesh community. We haven't seen you in a while, but Olivier and I actually kickstarted a cross-organizational collaboration channel on Slack there, and he had a number of good, I guess you can say, permutations of how he thought to move forward, or if I recall correctly, how to move forward with a cross-organizational collaboration, or the different ways in which it manifests itself, I should say. So go ahead, Olivier.
Yeah, so I'm Olivier Flébus. I'm in Toulouse in France. My background is around software for the first 20 years, maybe. And 10 years ago, switched to data, and now it's more about AI. So all together. 5 years ago, I joined the automotive industry. And this is where I first I've been involved in initiatives around marketplaces and data sharing between car makers, suppliers, and all the services providers, downstream or not. And this is where I had the idea, and when in this data mesh channel you started, I was right in the middle of it at the time. So now I've switched, okay. I was in Continental before as a supplier, tier 1 supplier. Now I'm in the former powertrain division that is called Vitesco Technologies. So I'm not right now in the middle of the topic, but still curious about this. I'm also a lecturer at the Toulouse Business School around data governance. So this topic of data sharing at the whole industry level, meaning the data mesh, but doing data as a product that you can share and maybe monetize with third parties is still a topic I'm curious about it.
Okay. And look forward to having your input on this. In fact, if I can bother the recesses of your memory, do you recall that some of the topic points that you put down on that cross-organizational collaboration, just to seed a conversation? Some of the things that you thought are the different permutations of the beginnings of a collaborative. Maybe I put you on the spot for a little bit there. I don't know if you recall.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't catch. If it was a question, I didn't catch it.
Oh, sorry. So I guess what I'm asking is, you put out some enumerated lists of various types of collaboratives for cross-organization initiatives. Yep. Do you recall some of those?
The simplest one, I don't actually, yeah, what I can say, I will search, okay, because I have this somewhere, but I will search. And what I remember, and the point is, it's a mix about the data product, we will call this maybe, and the services that make that data available for third parties. And typically the patterns we have identified so far, there are multiple ones. You could be interested in the history of data. So in that case, the data product is very simple. Okay, give me all the data you want, all the data I want. Okay, it's past data history, so it's a package, and it's maybe the simplest case. Then but it's a bad case, okay, because you're copying the data everywhere, and then ownership and it's also a problem for the guys who are publishing the data. They don't control this anymore. So if you want to put a kind of regulation governance of this, you have either to cut your data product into slices or things like this. And then you come to maybe business models like subscriptions, okay? But in that case, at the end, I think this is the same problem. And I think we had quite a list. And at the end of this list, I don't remember what's in the middle, but at the end, I think we were discussing things like federated learning, okay? That would mean if you want to do AI on the data, typically you don't first get the data and then do your own thing. You will directly access the platform to have the learning phase of your machine learning model happening right in the platform. So, and this would solve this, I'm losing control of the data when I'm opening the data, monetizing this. But if you give me a few minutes, maybe I will find what we discussed earlier on this channel.
Sure. Yeah, and I'd like to capture that. And that sounds, yeah, from what I recall, that's a good assessment of what we talked about and what you had put down. Any other comments around that? I will say that, you know, one of the interesting things is that, I'm sorry, did someone have something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Olivier a question.
Sure.
Just a lot of the focus that I have with my clients is, how do I define the boundary of a data product? But then how do I actually allow that data to be consumed and shared Now, I think there's 2 or 3 mechanisms that usually come to the top of the list, and some are suitable and some are not suitable for analytics. But obviously APIs, event streaming, so subscription based. But the one I'd be interested in feedback here is how do you provide access to huge amounts of information, which is one of the fundamental challenges that you have if you're, especially in the AI space. The AI models get better the more data, more useful data you actually send to them. So the challenge that my clients are having, and I'm having challenges with, I have some ideas, but look for feedback. How do I provide it as a data product? If I have like petabytes of data, how do I actually provide access to that data in a reasonable fashion? Again, APIs, small amounts of data. Event streaming, I can listen, but there's small amounts of data. How do I provide access to big amounts of data? Olivier, I don't know if that's part of what you're experiencing, but that would be a topic I'd very much like to explore. Not to digress from the topic here at hand, Andrew, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's always the same question. And I don't have a definitive answer, okay? And I think there is no definitive answer for this, but the question is, you have data, you want to monetize this, and you realize that it's not only by opening everything that this monetization will happen. So you need to build your I would say your business, okay? You need to build your service on top of the data you have, and this is quite tricky. And the starting point of our discussions now a couple months, maybe years, with Andrew in this Slack channel, is that it's kind of the same problem you have internally, okay? When, I don't know, business unit 1 or domain 1, to speak data mesh, domain 1 wants to share data or want to get data from domain 2. And the problems that you have internally in one company, they are maximized, magnified when you are thinking at an ecosystem level cross company. And then this service layer of exposition of your data, monetization of your data, or this data service layer, it's really mandatory. And so the answer to your question, Eric, is that to do this, you have to create, if this is part of creating your data product. Okay, so the answer of your data, of your question would be, then you have to build a data product, and then the services to access this will be built into this data product. And the data product is not only the underlying data that maybe you already have.
And Manuel, you actually spoke to this as well before the call officially started about NASA and their intra-organizational challenges look a lot like inter-organizational challenges.
Yeah. That's probably a point where Ellie also then can add something on the NASA part, because she worked quite a lot with them. I wanted to bring one example of the 2 things that you just discussed, namely the data product and what it should contain, and then this losing control and governance over data products that you give outside. We did a relatively large project together with the Central Bank of Italy, and as a central bank, of course, it's not just giving out data that may be a business disadvantage if it goes out and you lose control, but it may be a big legal issue because there's certain permitted data out and other things are not out. So it's simply it's an important topic of policy. You simply can't get it wrong even a single time. And there, an interesting aspect of that is, and whether I will now abstract from a data mesh knowledge graph and say data infrastructure. One interesting solution that came up in this collaboration is basically using the data infrastructure to have these policies directly in there, transparently done and operationalizable. So if there's certain thing that we want to make sure our data satisfies, something that may not get out is the simplest, so anonymization or cutting out data, being able to trust that at this layer where the border is between inside and outside, you have explicit parts of the knowledge graph or the data mesh that enforce this and can also be inspected and give transparency through the entire process. So for example, if it's a simple case of anonymization, you can have rules saying, well, certain kinds of personal characteristics may not be exposed up to a certain point. And then you can make the infrastructure enforce this and be absolutely sure that your infrastructure actually brings this to the public side. And of course, it's not always as easy, but that's something that in our space, in this space here where we are between databases, AI, different kinds of knowledge-based systems, we can actually make many things operationalized and a part of the data product saying, well, it really satisfies that policy. So if you look at central banks, explicit policies, what may be done, if it's in a space where it's not about absolute adherence, but only, not only is good, but where it's about business importance, that's similar. And that's the use case I wanted to bring in the topic. I think we have something more on that, but that I would have to prepare. I think we have a slide deck on it somewhere. Anyway, too much for our call, but I wanted to add this. Yeah, on the NASA example, maybe it's something that Ellie wants to say a bit more on that. Ellie, I told before about that we had this, I mean, I'm mostly from the technical side, but we had a social aspects of our topic workshop. And I presented the work that Ellie did together with NASA in this case. So to not put others' accomplishments on my table, so to say, maybe Ellie, you want to say something about that one?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I'm not sure that we have answers in the NASA use case about these bigger questions of sort of the data supply chain yet, but certainly NASA does have many data challenges, and they're attempting to figure them out, including, what do you do with petabytes of data? I know there was an instance that a researcher was attempting to do some study on a petabyte of data, and it took just a year to transfer that information. This may or may not be useful, but there is a graph database company called Flurry that connects with blockchain. So what their value proposition is basically you can put all of your data inside of a sort of a massive container that they then create subsections in with the blockchain. So you could, in theory, have your entire petabytes of data there and then just make differential access versus actually sending those. They've just been acquired a company and kind of look like they're moving towards healthcare. So I'm not sure what the solution looks like into the future. Our work at NASA so far has mostly been focused around sort of community knowledge graphs, knowledge commons, which are, to Emmanuel's point, the social side of building these systems. So obviously there's a lot of complexity to manage within access control and collecting data and the whole sort of back end. But what we're also trying to address is the fact that many of the knowledge graphs that are produced aren't used, right? They're beautifully made, but they don't connect to stakeholders. And there's a whole process that's actually quite technical to develop that engagement, to actually understand what kinds of design parameters need to be met in order to make a system that, for example, can be useful in a dynamic workflow. So one of the we're working with NASA currently, but there's a bigger initiative that Emmanuel and Kevin and many others have been part of in the federal government to basically develop principles for what's called an open knowledge network, which is basically a federation of knowledge graphs. And we're looking at use cases that are quite wide. I led a climate change use case. Supply chain is also one of the ones that Emmanuel and Kevin and I are working on, but also sort of like justice in the community and things like that. So conversations we had were, how do you create user interfaces that allow police officers or nurses to actually use them? And these are questions that become more logistical, right? Like what kind of time and access do you have in the live situation of data capture? So we go much further than the sort of the existing questions of usage into participatory design processes. And then, once that sort of emerged, the basic sort of design parameters are emerged, we then think about how to build that system alongside the development of a community that will use it, because so much of this requires sort of familiarity and engagement and championship and so on. So the work that we've done at NASA is specifically designed toward this. We have an ontology to represent the people who work at NASA, the scientists, and the salient details about them, such as their publications and maybe projects that they're involved in and partnerships and so on. So it's really a meta tool for seeing across the vast HR sort of resource of NASA and supporting partnerships and decision-making and so on. And it's very early stages currently, but we're also thinking about how a system like that could connect into other types of data management challenges or needs or projects. So, for example, there's mapping efforts to see what other organizations within NASA are trying to do things like this. Even connecting beyond NASA into like the broader earth science community with ESIP, another federal agency. Also thinking about, there's just massive data resources. How do we harmonize those? How do we actually organize the process of harmonizing those, which involves people and decision-making and so on. So all these kinds of questions at the very, very front end are what we're focused on in that particular case. And as long as I have the mic, it's worth pointing out that we are also more focused on climate change, particularly. So I'm building a knowledge graph that's designed to sort of organize the effort, hopefully to addressing climate. And so the idea is to, create an ontology about the problem space, but also the solution space, and connect that to the innovation force that we have, and then sort of logistically manage flow of resources and things like this. So Eric, I think you had shared that you were doing some work around climate for, what is it, open source climate?
Yeah, I was just going to actually mention that, but yeah, Open OS Climate, and I just wrote a paper about it, but we're trying to move to data mesh with the hope that we can make it easier to find, consume, and share climate data, which is like everywhere.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I don't know if Andrew, if you want to take the call somewhere else, but I would just love to hear about the challenges that you're coming across in sourcing and collecting. We've actually looked into this quite a bit. 4 or 5 of the folks here on the call have been working with me for a while.
Yeah, well, I think I do have to run it at 11, shortly before 11, but I would like to continue the dialogue. I think Scott Herleman actually suggested I reach out to you also, Ellie, if you know him. Yep. But anyway, so here's the fundamental challenge that we're having is there's tons of data out there. It's all over the place. It looks different, and consequently, it's not trustworthy. And what we're finding is, especially in financial services, but I think in other industries, you need trustworthy data if you want to actually do credible climate and ESG reporting. I'll focus more on the climate side than the ESG side, although they are obviously closely related. So the thing that we're trying to do is, how do we make sense of the 160,000 trees in the forest and provide some kind of tool to navigate? It's going to be something that mere mortals, so to speak, can actually use, as opposed to like a low-level data catalog. But how do we actually organize that data? It's really trying to create effectively a knowledge graph. We don't want to copy the data into any other place. We just want to point to it and provide the metadata that explains what it is and how you can actually go about getting it, so an enterprise can go and do their climate and ESG reporting. So it actually is a wonderful intersection between data mesh, which again provides the boundaries, the marketplace that provides the way for people to find it, and the knowledge graph that provides that glossary, business glossary, and referential locations to all those trees in the forest. So it's a perfect match for this group, I think, actually, to provide some help with.
May I share a thought? Because I'm linking back to Olivier, and in regards to trust and the data being, if I see that in Eric and what you have there, is basically to divide the data and the trust in a way, so that you have the data, but the trust is a separate entity. So you're modeling that in a graph, looking at the data that is available, and the trust becomes something separate from it in terms of having the votes of confidence on a specific data set or a specific layer on that data set, or the lineage that has been there that has been verified up to a specific point. So more or less you want to capture that trust metadata separately in a way, and that becomes, with Olivier's thinking, I merged the thoughts there into actually being this federation, not only of the data itself, but also the layers of metadata around it to enable trustworthiness of the knowledge graphs. Is that a little bit in the direction?
That is exactly the direction. So there's two elements to it. One is the metadata and having trust in, you know, the metadata being pointing to the right place and having the right data. But there's also a social aspect to it. Ultimately, if corporations are going to use the data for their reporting purposes, just by using it is a vote of trust, because they will, you know, they won't use it unless there's an army of people that have vetted it. So there's a social aspect to this also that says, you know, if you think about GitHub, you know, starring something or watching something is a fantastic analog for providing trustworthy indications of trustworthiness to the data. So that's when I heard, I think Ellie, you were mentioning the whole social aspect to it. It is, you know, 100 trustworthy data results in this context almost 100% from the social aspect to it, the ability to verify that I've used it, and I, as an enterprise, you know, out of that community of hundreds of thousands of enterprise, believe that is trustworthy. It's a pretty cool concept. So that's kind of where we're heading. And I actually have to run to a call to talk about this with some of my OS Climate partners. So, but I would very much, I mean, just real quickly, if anybody is interested in having a further dialogue, Ellie, it looks like I would like to reach out to you if that's okay. So I'll just send you a quick email. Anybody else that wants to participate, I would love to get your feedback. Again, the focus on OS Climate and how we can, you know, make climate data easier to find, share, and consume. So just send me a quick email and I'll connect the group of us with you, Ellie, and we'll see where things go.
Sounds great. Yeah, I think most of the folks here who would join are part of my group. So we can organize a call with everyone that we have.
Awesome. So just send me your emails and I'll set up a Zoom link and we'll get to this. But thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is real exciting and I look forward to further dialogues. Thank you, everybody.
Eric.
I have a question to follow up for Oliver, part of the first set of questions, the whole idea of interface and controlled APIs into the data. In the government for a long time, we've looked for things called indicators. It'll take 10 years to come up with an indicator. And one of the things that came to us quickly is, wouldn't it be nice? Because the situation, the environment in this world changes fairly quickly. And by the time we create an application or an indicator, oftentimes the problems have changed. So we're now dealing with we're fighting last year's war, so to speak. So one of the things that I had explored was the idea of trying to, you know, over document or hyper document the metadata and the connectivity between the data, so you could build effectively a just-in-time indicator. In other words, have a real big kitchen, a real big pantry, so that chefs could create knowledge from the data. Because again, people don't consume data, they consume knowledge. And this trade-off between building relatively static interfaces or designing interface and then putting the data behind the interface, as opposed to building kind of a data fabric, which I guess what data mesh is attempting to do. And that idea of building quick interfaces with the ability to put security and heuristics in it has been, for me, kind of a dilemma. I don't know exactly where I am with that. I was just curious how other people thought about it and if they've had other challenges with that. In essence, building an infrastructure and then allowing and bringing other people to the store to essentially build dinners, so to speak.
The way I see this, once again, many options, but I think the question you ask is like also the definition of your data product, of your service. Okay, what's the value in this? And then in the patterns we identified in the past, we had these two basic scenarios. Either it's a one-to-many, okay? If I am, I don't know, a weather company and I want to create a weather data product, there is a very good chance that that data product, that same product, would be consumed by every consumer in the same way, okay? So it's one product and many consumers. And for this, it's a kind of one B2C business, or at least so the product first, and then if you're on in the market with that product, and if people want to access to this, okay, they buy the access and they have the product exactly as you, the owner of the product, have designed this. And you accept to lose control, okay, because the product actually, even if it's one-to-many, you accept to kind of transfer the ownership, okay? The consumer becomes the owner of a copy. And in a more maybe B2B case or one-to-one, you would expose maybe some of your data products as advertisements. And then just meaning that, okay, I have this data, I can package this that way. If you want this, you can take this, maybe or not. But the real thing is that maybe in some cases, the consumer, they will want to have their own customized product, maybe. And in that case, it becomes a one-to-one relationship, maybe discussion, and in this, it may be simpler in some cases, but it doesn't scale, okay? Because the work you are doing at the product owner, at the editor of the product, it's really a one-to-one basis. And in the middle, you have many possibilities. And this is the reason, I think, one of the basic reasons why data marketplaces are valuable for everyone, for producers and consumers. But at least in the automotive industry, we didn't find the real thing to do there. Okay, we have marketplaces, we have big data owners that are not doing so much things with the data, or at least not sharing externally, and the ecosystem is still exploring opportunities, I would say, like I think in many other domains.
I could add a little bit there, because I saw the problem in a different light. So I see this side of it, but I also see a different one. And I don't know if that is the right direction there, Kavan, but what I'm thinking is that in terms of the data, there are different points. Usually when we talk about data, we're talking about discrete numbers, either it's 1 or it's 2. We talk fairly seldom about a range of numbers. And I think that in climate, we have a number of things that are actually ranges of confidence. So I'm thinking that there is a confidence interval that could be expressed in different ways, saying that here is approximately the value. And the more data we have, the more we can confirm that this is approximately where it is. And so I'm thinking in such a data pipeline where we have a number of discrete elements of the data that illustrates the approximate points of it. And we can say that we are likely, we can estimate that we have a confidence data. And that is where the trust comes in, that we can start to see that the data looks in a certain way. We have a normal distribution, a log normal distribution, some other distribution. That means that over time, we can actually enforce the underlying data and see that it's actually somewhat relevant because we're taking these different numbers. And that helps us to bring, I think, a picture of the original data where we can actually have confidence, and we can more quickly have a confidence of an indicator being more or less right. We know that it's right to this degree. And I think that is an important point in talking about the data itself. And when you're federating, then you're using the different parts of the ecosystem of data, and you can put those together that way in a pipeline. That is one way to think about it. I've been into quantitative risk for cybersecurity, and to look at it from that point of view, finding the confidence intervals, finding the probabilities, and looking at the impact and probability that way. And that has helped me to look at some of the data points which are very hard to predict or understand, but when you have a calibrated subject that knows his matter, they can shrink the confidence interval and have fairly good numbers, even though you don't know the exact number. I don't know if this is the direction, but that is one way of capturing many different sources in one, and to see that more data will actually give you a better indication of where you, of that indicator or a new indicator based on previous data. It's maybe not a knowledge graph problem, but I think that putting a number together with the distribution of what that number might be is an interesting topic that I think is interesting to model.
I think one of the things that's coming out of this is basically we're really talking about the concept of consensus. And do we accept that the sources reflect that consensus? And can we model that? And yes, we can. I mean, we use consensus all the time, whether it's at a technology level or a social level. And we can build those protocols into the pipelines and the different layers that are in effect here. But what's interesting as part of that consensus is also the degree of trust in the infrastructure itself, because I think that's an important element. And listening to the conversation over the course of the last half hour or so, one of the things that struck me is a parallel that I've seen in some of the regulated industries, where they use the concepts of what you might recall as like a ringed architecture. Or back in the old school days, we used to talk about things like demilitarized zones and various things in terms of security access. But I think you've got the same principles in play, where if you imagine that there's a ring of information and different degrees of implementation in the technology stack, where, if you like, the center is the most trusted, most secret, most guarded, and it has high levels of confidence and so forth. And then you ring out to different layers, and you can put your products or your sources into those layers and decide where the degree of trust is. And then, of course, you add on top of the mix, the consensus that needs to be formed in terms of that trust. So I think we're all kind of talking around the subject a wee bit, but also in a way that is, to my mind, there's a common agreement that we have the same issues.
Yeah, you know, and it seems that just put this in the chat that earlier we were talking about the likes and that gives you confidence in the data set. If somebody else, that whether you know them or not, agrees that this is trustworthy, then you start to trust it. So trust seems to be a form of consensus, really, and that's the glue that binds all of this together. If you don't start with trust or have facilities to proliferate trust, you're not going to get there, I guess.
What's interesting about the community for consensus is that you don't necessarily, like you say, Andrew, you don't necessarily know any one party or actor within the network, but the network as a whole has a quality about it that people trust. You know, so it's because you buy on Amazon, right, and you don't know half any of the people who are on there, but somehow you attribute that there's a value in that network, and that they're all talking to the same level of quality that you feel that you can trust.
Yeah,
I think that.
Oh, go ahead, Ellie.
I want to jump in because I think that trust is maybe broader than consensus only. So if we think about what a data, item is, it's a representation of something that happened at some point in time. And if you didn't capture that yourself, then you weren't there. So what we need is a proxy, right? Which one of those proxies could be a consensus as a form, but it could also be, for example, what Philippe was describing, which is the well-calibrated domain expert who could interpret, for example, those materials and discern the difference between data that is likely to be accurate and data that doesn't seem to fit the patterns and therefore should be excluded. So I think as we think about these challenges, especially as we think about them in spaces that are more technical, like ESG and supply chain versus, purchasing on Amazon, the question is sort of how do we find proxies or design proxies? Are there cultural mechanisms for that, such as the Amazon network? Or are we, needing to surface real academics who have knowledge that can sort of be involved in these networks in some way? Or, what does it look like?
Yeah, something comes to mind that Philippe said, and I agree with him, but one of the things I found is that when you get the business managers in an organization and they see derivative data or aggregates, sums, whatever counts that are done by technology folks, that's when they start not trusting. Like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how they came to that conclusion. So lineage as a precursor to that derivative data set is also seems to be important for getting that trust. Because derivative data automatically puts people on, for some reason, I don't know why, on the defensive. How did you get there? They want to know how you came to that conclusion. So how do we address that?
And especially that is a very hard problem in risk, because risk are estimates. We never know if it's accurate, but we can see that there is scientific proof behind actually be able to calibrate someone in expressing risk to confidence intervals and transferring that to a different domain. And that is a hard sell in general to someone that is new to it. Okay, so you sat there and you estimated something. Yes, but there is actually something behind it. There is training behind it. And most of the risk management has no training behind it. It's just guesswork. So that means that someone that expresses something, they don't have the qualification to actually say anything. And that's the worst part. So it's really important, as you say, to say, how did this happen? And I think that is something that is very important as well in constructing knowledge graphs, that you can see these patterns of how things came about. And not only in time, but also by references.
One of the things that's interesting is the idea, we like to think we get to consensus, but in reality, we often only deal with voting. And if you look at, for example, Google, their brilliance was getting people to trust a link, i.e. by voting. So how many people link to now that's wonderful. Voting works very effectively in one situation. Another situation, you might say on Twitter, in the political scene that we've just gone through, people are talking about how people move or vote for extremes. They vote for people like themselves and reinforce their own bubble. So, that kind of, there's this balancing act between how do you generate expertise and consensus with transparency to try to move, instead of bifurcation of different communities, and different communities are going to happen, but how do you engender voting that develops trust? I mean, I guess I'm not coming up with many answers. I'm coming up with more questions than answers.
That's
Well,
important.
I have that's how we go forward. I have a thought about that maybe what we need to do is go beyond voting, which is the action, right, of clicking on the link or whatever, into something that's more dialogical, which is a trust building process. So for example, in the NASA use case, we recently did a vocamp, right? So we were trying to get to a basic ontology for a department there. And we had a lot of struggle because the scientists themselves were really skeptical that a knowledge instrument was helpful, since they themselves disagree about so much, right? They were really concerned about codifying that language, because whose language, right? And so one of the things that I suggested was actually that we could use the knowledge framework as a way to explain where there are these dissonances between the field and make that more sort of transparent for people, and potentially help the field to resolve it through that. So I think here the answer may lay in diplomacy, which is text-based and sort of or language-based and happens before the vote, the moment of voting.
Yeah, and perhaps to say something that both connects to this topic and some of the different ways of looking at trust as provenance, trust as consensus, or so one of the main things there, and one sees that when talking with a lot of people on data infrastructures is that it's usually a discussion of either or, versus in most of our aspects, actually it's strengthening, right? If you have for provenance plus a consensus mechanism of whatever kind, and it's not a question of, okay, it gets worse because we have two different ways of trusting it. It actually gets better. And that's what previously it was a lot harder to transport all of this to the point where you can actually see how trustworthy a particular item is. Today we are in a situation where we have all of these things, and well, in many situations actually making sure that the user or the stakeholder who sees it understands what different ways of trust are there, like different consensus mechanisms, different provenance, and so on and so forth. So this plurality of coexistence of different ways is actually good.
And that's where the metadata comes back in, isn't it? Where, you know, because you can have different degrees of reporting against any one of those dimensions, and then they can all aggregate up to give you an overall picture, but you can still drill into the individual parts to say, you know, it might come from a trustworthy source, but maybe the actual data itself might have a degree of accuracy or some concern around that about it. So, you know, you're aggregating the whole thing up to arrive at a point at which you feel that, yes, I can use this, or no, I can't, or somewhere in between.
I came to think about a different concept that is used for distributed trust. It's from the GNU Privacy Guard, PGP, where you have these networks of trust where you sign one other's keys, and that provides trust. So if I trust a specific person or many people that trust the same subject, then I can apply trust there as well. And I came to this thanks to Amala and your expression there, that we probably need to look at credentials as well, because blind trust is one thing, the GitHub variant. But there is, in general, in how we express trust, is that we have trustworthy sources. If that source tells us that there is trust, there's credentials that say, someone with credentials standing behind saying that this element is trusted, then suddenly we're willing to trust it a lot more. And the question is a little bit, how do we encode that in a good way? Because it's very topic specific, it's very subject specific, and perhaps not generic enough. But maybe something to think about on the topic.
One of the things that I've run into over time is that data is not black and white. It's not true or false. It's an approximation. And for example, the data that we release is considered the gold standard. And yet Wall Street releases a lot of data before we release our data. It's not considered as good, but sometimes it's more timely. So one of the things that we're always trading off is, do you want something that's more timely? Do you want something that's more accurate, but 2 years after the fact? So there's different gradations of accuracy that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And again, it's almost like it'd be nice if you could let populations sort themselves out and let them vote using people who are credentialed within that group, take a lead, but then find some patterns to vote on what is most trustworthy for this particular problem. You know, again, nobody cares about data; they care about knowledge. And there's this layer between the data and the person who constructs the data to tell a story that allows people to see knowledge. And again, what I was going to say earlier was, I built a lot of systems where we'd build a system for the application, for the things that people wanted, and then, you know, a year later they wanted us to build a completely new application on the same data, because somebody had a different question to ask. So I kind of I got to the software engineering piece where you build an infrastructure, and then later on, you start building interfaces for particular problem domains. And the more general, because it turned out building the infrastructure always took more time than any other part of the business. And it was usually the thing that was least appreciated. So the trust issue is a very fascinating.
It is. What you just said brought me back to the book Principles by Ray Dalio. And so they have this concept of dot voting in their enterprise. I don't know if you've read the book, but in principle, the dot voting is a calibrated subject. So people that are trusted to say something about this subject because their peers have said that this person in the enterprise knows something about this specific subject. So what they do in the enterprise is that they use dot voting. So everyone has their small app. So when you have a big conference, they ask the audience, okay, so what are your thoughts on this topic? Should we go with A, or should we go with B or C? What are the alternatives? Radical transparency, radical candor, what is the idea in their enterprise? And so what happens is that everyone votes, and then they show the two votes. They show the subject matter expert vote, which usually gives a very specific set. You should go with A or B, because that is what the subject matter expertise gives. But the general vote is maybe in the other direction, because that is the popular vote, where you see that it's actually not helpful to bring the necessary outcomes towards the question. So the answer is not relevant when you're looking to what the subject matter expert says. And this I bring into this subject because probably we need to think about how to encode this in order to get more valuable data, because popular votes are not the same as the subject matter expertise vote. And we are seeing this more and more in the world, where we see that populism moves forward and the real actual subject matter expertise, the science that is behind, is neglected.
It would be interesting to be able to say, you know, particularly with the populism that's going on in social media, that moves forward without any facts. You know, it'd be interesting to find some way to weight, you know, opinions based on credentials or facts or something, so that you can effectively, if I'm effectively letting somebody proxy my consensus because I trust that person, I'd like to have some kind of voting or some type of information, some data on how much I can trust that proxy who's effectively voting on the value of that data or that solution for me.
So
I don't know how you create something that automatically. I'm sorry.
trust but verify kind of thing.
Trust and continually verify.
Yeah, re-verify, because there's an important subject there in terms of re-verification, because that needs to be done over time, because as you say, the opinion changes. Sorry, Ellie, you were saying.
Yeah, so I think that both of these questions, the previous conversation and this that Kevin's just mentioned, come back to the idea of explainability and legibility, right? People are pursuing populism because the language of expertise is now so abstract for most people that they don't understand why we should listen to the expert. And that's a tremendous challenge of, you know, sort of marketing and communications, which amongst many other spaces, sustainability has really struggled with, right? We have these reports coming from the IPCC that are 3,500 pages and they're extremely dense and they're full of charts that, you know, your typical person can't interpret. I think that this also connects to the idea of, you know, if we do have a proxy, which is something that is sort of politically not so supported at the moment in many places, but if we do have that, the way to sort of create, you know, continuing trust in the proxy is through storytelling, is through continual explanation of how decisions are made, how, you know, sort of what is happening behind the scenes. If you are looking at a statistic or a recommendation, why that is being delivered. And if we think about COVID, which was maybe the, you know, sort of the biggest experiment in this space, a lot of the disappointments that have come out in, you know, recent times, looking back at the data and the decisions that were made are focused around, you know, they told us with such certainty that it was supposed to be or was going to be this way, and then we find out that it kind of isn't. I think that, you know, being more transparent in the storytelling at that time forward about the unknowns, right? This is a completely new disease. It acts in very different ways. Like, here's the risk potential, you know, if you do this, and we think this is good, right? I think that would have gone a long way towards creating a different experience with that. And this is sort of a rule of thumb that we can take more broadly, right? People want to understand, especially now that they are used to sort of so much information at their fingertips, so much information on Google that is very simple. They want to know why things are being done the way that they are. And yet there's so much complexity in those decisions that, you know, something has to be sort of simplified for expression.
Yeah, speaking of collaboration and, being confident in something, what is the relationship between saying I don't know and the potential for collaboration? Is that a deal breaker or not? Does that actually let you move forward and build trust? I don't know.
I have a brother who's an evangelical. And he wanted to talk to me about faith. And I said, you have to understand, in science, there is no faith. We don't believe in anything. And all we do is we say there's more and more evidence that this is more true than that. And to some degree, I think that has to be communicated, that data by definition is wrong. It's just more right than everything else. And somehow, this idea of an automatic voting, weighted voting system is an intriguing one. I don't know how to do it. I do like the idea of transparency. I do like the idea of relevance that Ellie was talking about in terms of making stories that make the language of expertise accessible, because oftentimes experts take pride in making acronyms that only that small community understands, and every community does it. So how do you generalize it, like Ellie's saying, and at the same time make it transparent so somebody who could be very detailed and exacting can go down and say, well, there's issues with this and this and this, but it's still the best guess we've got,
Yeah.
I would say in general, I think the question was well put, Andrew, in terms, I'm willing to trust the one that says, I don't know, more than the one that goes with dead certainty. This is how it is, especially in today. And especially the one that says, I don't know, but this is the range. This is how it looks. This is how my uncertainty looks. And then suddenly, then we start to understand how they're actually thinking. And so there was someone in the thread previously that wrote, show me how you think. It's go back to the math work. I don't know who wrote that, but I think it's an important concept, that if you can show how your thought patterns were and how you came to the conclusion, then probably actually did your homework. Probably.
Yeah, and actually, I think that about this trust or confidence in the data, a motivation for cross-organization data sharing is also to give the ability to data consumers to cross-check information. Okay, so if partner A is saying this, then if you have another independent, data source for more or less the same thing, you will be able to increase the accuracy of what you're thinking. And in the automotive industry, we have an example for this. A service typically warning you about in the next turn, the road may be slippery, because it's icy or I don't know. Because actually, car makers, they have the data of, they can sense that the road is slippery, with your ESP system or whatever. So every car maker has or could have quite easily the information where a car is driving, it is slippery or not. But if you do not aggregate all the data, you will not be able to build something very accurate and trustable about what is the conditions of the road in any position. And so there is really this, and if nobody shares the data, we cannot build that information. But if everybody agrees to share the pieces of information they have, because no car maker has cars everywhere, on every road, but you increase your chances of having the right information if you share the data. And so this is really a motivation, I think, in many areas.
Yeah. Ellie had a good comment to that. She says, trust and sharing data should be our topic next week. I agree.
One last thing I'd like to add before this stimulated the thought is, I was talking to somebody at Dun & Bradstreet, and they're trying to identify companies, which is very difficult because they try to do it internationally. And what they're trying to do is understand the credit worthiness of a company that you want to do business with. And since companies spell their names differently in different parts of the world, they don't really know, which is something that census does too. When we're trying to do record linkage, your name is the least reliable thing to do record linkage on. So what they do at Dun & Bradstreet is they take several data sources and they kind of put them together, and they weight them to basically make a decision on what is the right name. So it's one thing that a graph does, knowledge graph or whatever, is if it does, it allows us to link multiple pieces of information together that allows us to effectively vote on unemployment or employment, or, you know, the safety of this particular car, because there'll be multiple measures they're taking from different dimensions, different directions that give us information. So one thing a graph can help people do is improve the trust, because you may have orthogonal or independent streams of data either moving the same direction or moving apart. And that I've never seen that formalized. I've seen that done ad hoc, but never in a systematic way.
It sounds a little bit like encoding a Bayesian tree in a knowledge graph and seeing the results. I don't know if so more or less seeing the probability distribution in a tree to try to figure out how everything connects, and being able to dynamically adjust that based on the data that you have. So it's more or less a reinforcing Bayesian tree. It sounds like that in terms of what you're expressing, but I don't know.
It's a lot like you listen to the stock market and they'll say, you know, establishment says this many people are employed. The household survey said this many people employed. The private manufacturers index say this is going on. So you have multiple forms of data. They all seem to be pointing in a certain direction, although the measures themselves are often very different.
I don't know if there's a name for, because what I think that Bayesian trees are specific probability distributions. But I'm thinking that there might also be trees that you would do a Monte Carlo simulation on to look at an outcome, where you instead have distributions that are normally distributed, or you have log normal distribution in a tree to calculate a certain outcome. I don't know if that has a name, and if someone knows, it would be fantastic. It's something I realize I've been looking for a while, because I want to encode those in graphs to be able to take different parts of the graph and coalesce that into an outcome. But yeah, I'll continue the research on that.
Excellent.
It looks like we have our hours up. Happy to stay for a bit more, but I recognize people's time is important, so I just thought I'd bring that up. There's nothing more to discuss. We'll meet again in a few weeks, and I'll be sure to put this recording on YouTube.
Thanks, Andrew. It was a great call as always. Super excited for the next one.
Yeah.
Thanks for today.
Bye, everyone.
Fantastic.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.